John Hilary, you are one of TTIP's strongest critics and has written a report that we at Arena Idea has translated to Swedish and is available outside or as a download from our webpage. John Hilary has long been at the forefront of the debate on international trade and development, and he is the president of the organization War on Want. Today he is here to explain to us why our politicians should not sign this treaty. John Hilary, the floor is yours.
Ragnar, thank you so much, and thank you both to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and to Arena for inviting me here today, and thank you also to our very kind translator who is enabling myself and Florian to follow this very technical discussion, which is absolutely brilliant. I'm really pleased to be here to talk about TTIP because, in a way, Sweden and the UK have a particular responsibility for European trade. If you think back 10 years, it was Peter Mandelson, one of the refugees from New Labour, if you want, who ended up being the European Trade Commissioner at that time. I think, Joachim, you probably worked with him when you were at the Commission. And I think that was an unmitigated disaster for most of Europe, and we're very apologetic for having given him to Europe when we kicked him out of Britain. Now we have a new chance because you have a Swedish Trade Commissioner, Cecilia Malmström, and we hope for better things from her. But for that to be the case, we need to have a profound change in the direction of European Union trade policy, and particularly in this new generation of trade deals, TTIP, also the EU-Canada deal, which Joachim referred to, CETA, and a whole range of other ones. And so my job, I think, in the next 10 minutes is to explain to you why a lot of the claims that are made for these new generation of trade deals are not credible, and also why there are really substantial threats that they pose, both to our economy and to our democracy and to the social model of Europe that we hold dear. So that is my task in 10 minutes, and I'm going to go fairly swiftly through it, and then I hope we'll have more time in the discussion afterwards to pick up individual points. The European Commission claims that TTIP is going to be a boost to the economies of both the European Union and the USA, something which will help us to take wing away from the recession of the last few years. And they based this claim on a study which they commissioned from a London-based think tank, the Centre for Economic Policy Research, the CEPR. And from that report, they claimed that if we manage to get an ambitious outcome from the TTIP negotiations, we will see an extra 0.5% added to European Union GDP by the year 2027. And everybody says, well, that's nice. You know, what's not to like? People want to have a bit more money, and it's nice to have a bit of growth. Unfortunately, the report has been shown not to be credible in any way. It is based on false assumptions, and we don't need to talk here about the CGE modeling, but we can discuss that later if people wish. False assumptions which have been proved in the past to be very, very bad at predicting what the outcomes of trade negotiations are going to be. These are computable general equilibrium models which are based on very simplistic assumptions of how markets respond to shocks and to changes in the international trading system. And interestingly, for us in the UK context, we have confirmed with our government officials and even with government ministers that they don't really believe the outcomes of these reports anyway. They've said it's nice figures, but actually these things never have any relation to reality. And what's interesting for me is also they've been very selective about the bits of those reports which they bring out into the public domain, i.e. they always take the best bits and say everybody's going to grow, everybody's going to be better off. But they don't tell you what was actually deep in the detail. And we did a little bit of digging, and we found out that if you look deep into the report which the European Commission commissioned at the beginning of the negotiations, you find a much more disturbing reality. Because according to their figures, not our figures, according to their figures, TTIP will lead to the direct loss of at least 1 million jobs in the EU and the US combined. In the EU, a minimum of 600,000 jobs will go as a direct result of TTIP. And we've put that, I've brought some copies of this blue document, which is produced by War on Want and all of the trade unions in the UK, which gives you the chapter and verse of where to find that calculation. It's also available on the War on Want website. And what's interesting is that there's been a new study published just last month from Tufts University, which has come up with exactly the same conclusion. Using a different model, they use the approved model of the United Nations, they've come up with the same figure, that 600,000 jobs will go in the European Union. And importantly as well, the European Commission states that it is highly likely that those people who lose their jobs will not find other employment. As you know, perhaps not so much in Sweden, but in the rest of the European Union, there is a crisis of unemployment, and particularly in the southern states of the European Union, where you have youth unemployment of over 50%, there is no possibility of the market suddenly providing hundreds of thousands of new jobs to be able to soak up the hundreds of thousands who will lose their work as a direct result of TTIP. In addition to that, Northern Europe, so us, the UK, Sweden, and other Northern European countries, are predicted to suffer significant losses in terms of exports. And these are the figures that you're not being told. And the European Commission, and certainly my government, have been challenged to come up with actual backing for their figures, and they have not been able to produce it. But I want to concentrate really on the content of TTIP and why it proves to be such a threat to our economies and our societies. And the first thing to notice about it, it is not a free trade agreement. If you think about free trade agreements of the past, these were primarily focused upon the lowering of tariff barriers, the income taxes and the export taxes at the border for goods trade. Well, the European Union and the USA really do not present any tariff barriers to each other. Really, it's very, very low. In one or two sectors, these are small problems. And they've said from the European Commission explicitly, this is not about tariff barrier removal so much as going behind the border and looking at different aspects of our shared economies and our shared social spaces, which are not about tariffs and not even about goods trade. So I think if I wanted to sort of leave you with one message here, this isn't a free trade agreement. This is something completely different. And that's where the three pillars of TTIP make it clear why it's so different. The first pillar of TTIP, which is the central pillar, is deregulation. Because they're not dealing with tariff barriers. They've said explicitly, we want to get rid of the non-tariff barriers, the regulations, the rules, and the standards which act as a barrier to business being able to maximize its profits on both sides of the Atlantic. And we thought, well, what do they mean? I mean, when they say they want to get rid of these regulatory barriers, what are they talking about? And conveniently, they made lists of all of the things that they want to get rid of because they stand in the way of business. Labor standards was one of the things on the list. Because clearly, if you are from the USA and there's no right to paid holidays at all, well, why on earth do you want to start having to bear that burden of having paid holidays in the European Union? Food safety standards. 70% of all processed food in US supermarkets contains genetically modified ingredients. And we in Europe have said we don't want to have GM ingredients in our food chain. The US Secretary of State for Agriculture is saying, you don't get to choose. Under free trade, you have to get with the program. If we eat it in the States, you can eat it in Europe. Similarly, beef, 90% of all beef produced in the USA is produced with growth hormones. So the cattle are injected with growth hormones, they grow more quickly, they can be slaughtered 4 weeks earlier and therefore become that much more profitable. The problem is that those growth hormones have been found to be carcinogenic, and therefore the European Union has banned them for 10 years. The USA says that's a block, that's a barrier to trade, we want to get rid of it. On environmental rules, we have a completely different regulatory system in the European Union based on the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle states if you, business, cannot prove that your chemical substance is safe, then you're not allowed to introduce it into commercial usage. In the USA, it's 100% the other way around. If the government cannot prove it's unsafe, then business gets to introduce it. And this leads to a situation like in cosmetics, for example. In cosmetics, I've read the European Union list of the 1,300 substances which are banned for use in cosmetics in the European Union. You can't understand most of the names, or indeed you can't even pronounce the names. These are all incredibly difficult chemical substances. You look at the US list, it's 12. And that gives you a sense of the regulatory difference between the two countries. And that is what they want to harmonize. They want to remove those differences because business on both sides of the Atlantic wants to be able to operate free from the social standards, the environmental standards, and the labor standards that we hold to be the most important things about the European social model. And that is what is predominantly under attack from the deregulation agenda within TTIP. So pillar one, deregulation. Pillar two, privatization. Now, this isn't new for trade agreements. Even the World Trade Organization in its Uruguay round tried to introduce more services trade liberalization into the agenda. And what you see there is more and more opportunities for the private sector to enter markets which have previously been closed to private capital. And that can be in terms of health, education. We've seen the European Union's offer, which has been leaked, the offer on this services trade within TTIP. We've seen that. And yes, health services, medical services, education services, post, transport, wastewater services, and many, many more, they're all there on the table for TTIP negotiations. And the European Commission has said to us that it's absolutely true that if a private company in future from the USA wishes to challenge a renationalization of any of these services, then we, the European people, will have to pay them for the privilege. So we can come back to that because I know I'm being asked to wrap up my talk. The third pillar, because I can't miss the third pillar. The third pillar, alongside deregulation and privatization, is the new power that TTIP would give for investors, foreign corporations, to sue European countries, European people, in secret courts, bypassing the domestic judicial system, for damages if they do not get to maximize their profits, as they had been led to expect. And this is perhaps the most controversial, most open debate around TTIP which we've seen at the moment. There are many examples. I'll just give you one or two. Philip Morris, the big tobacco company, is suing the government of Australia for billions of dollars for daring to introduce a public health law which requires companies to market their tobacco in plain packaging. It's not that Philip Morris had a contract with the Australian government to sell cigarettes to its people. It's that it has been able to use these powers from other treaties to be able to challenge a perfectly good public health law. Acmea, the Dutch company, has challenged and won against the Slovak government's reversal of health privatization. Health privatization was incredibly unpopular in Slovakia. The government was elected on a ticket to reverse that privatization, and then they were sued successfully by a Dutch company. Veolia, the French company, suing the Egyptian government for daring to raise the minimum wage. And it's this completely anti-democratic power which is causing people across Europe to stand up and say, no, we don't want it. So the final thing I'm going to say before I lead into the bigger debate we can have later is this is an incredibly unpopular treaty across Europe. People see it's not a trade agreement at all. It's a massive transfer of power from society to capital. And that is why in country after country after country, the trade union movement is absolutely firm against this. People in the environmental movement are firm against it. And people in all walks of society are coming out against it. When the European Commission had its consultation on the ISDS powers, these investor powers in TTIP, they thought they would have maybe 200 or 300 responses. They got 150,000 responses from people across Europe saying no. And I think that is a signal that they've made a big mistake with TTIP, and that's why we must fight against it. Thank you.
Thank you, John.